Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponder. My name is Neil Trotter, the host of the show, and we are here in my backyard trying this new setup here. Hopefully it works. Okay, so today we are going to, first of all, I'm going to get my bug spray. That's the first thing I'm going to do because these bugs are killing me. So wait just a second. Bug spray acquired, all natural, so that you might see me doing multiple applications of that. But today what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about, as the title suggests, Hegel's phenomenology. No, not his phenomenology. The science of logic. I'm trying to get a good thumbnail here. And that's pretty much the best I could do, because I printed this work online for free, and it's pretty huge. I just got it in this big ass binder. So there's that. And yeah, we're going to be talking about that. So the Hegel science of logic. And yeah, so if you know, or if you're familiar with this channel, you know I don't do book summaries. And if you're new, hello, welcome. I don't do book summaries. What I do is I talk about themes that are very interesting to me, philosophical themes that the text, centers on or focuses on or brings up and prominently discusses. And then I kind of use that text as a kind of a jumping off point to some important themes that we can apply to the real world, to philosophical discussion. So what we're going to be talking about here is identity, because Hegel talks about identity a lot. He's really into identity, and I would argue like he's into identity politics. He talks about identity politics a lot. Now, I know that is a buzzword, or a word that is very taboo in today's society, much like the word woke or the word, SJW, what is it? Social justice warrior, these politically charged words, CRT, critical race theory. And you might say like, oh, don't bring that up with that discussion about Hegel. He's not talking about that at all. But I think he is, and we're going to read a lot of quotes from the text, actual reading quotes from the text, where I'm going to kind of show why I think that's the case, right? So when we talk about identity politics, politics, if you look at the root word, the meaning of the word, as if you break it down, it talks about power. Politics is like the control of power. Really, that's what the literal meaning of politics is. And so when we talk about identity politics, I know the contemporary one definition of identity politics is just using some sort of fabricated identity to assert some sort of false sense of power. But identity and power kind of go hand in hand in a real sense. Definitely there are situations where people identify as certain persons or people, or they identify as certain ways of being, and that threatens power structures. That disrupts the flow of power in our society. That's why it's so controversial or taboo, right? Because it's sometimes people identify as certain things, and it just completely throws a wrench in the whole social economic power paradigm that we have in our society. And Hegel talks about that. He really does. So I'm gonna read you some quotes where we can discuss that. Okay, so I printed this free from the internet. You can find most of Hegel's works for free because they're on the internet, because it's way past their copyright. But what if you're trying to follow along and you're trying to read along with me, or you're trying to cite the quotes that I'm saying? Well, I guess what I'll do is I will refer you to these numbers, and I forgot what they were called. The numbers that are here on the right and left side margins, those I forgot because somebody commented on a video saying the name of that type of system, but I just slipped my mind. If you know the system, it's of that pagination system, let me know. But it's a way to universally refer to like old school texts that like many universities or academic institutions or scholarly institutions, they adopt this type of pagination system. And that way it doesn't, these multiple editions kind of universally agree upon like, okay, this is where we're at in terms of like my citations. So the citation here is 11.200.261. We have here this subsection identity. Literally is called identity. So I'll read you this. Essence is simple immediacy as sublated immediacy. Sublated means kind of assimilated, right? And so its negativity is its being. It is equal to itself in its absolute negativity, by virtue of which otherness and reference to other have as such simply disappeared into pure self equality. Essence is therefore a simple self-identity. Let's keep going. This self-identity is the immediacy of reflection. It is not that self-equality which being is, or also nothing, but a self-equality which, in producing itself as unity, does not produce itself over again, as from another, but is a pure production from itself and in itself, essential identity. It is not therefore abstract identity or an identity which is the result of a relative negation preceding it, one that separates indeed what it distinguishes from it, but for the rest leaves it existing outside it, the same after as before. Being and every determinateness of being has rather sublated itself, not relatively, but in itself, and this simple negativity, the negativity of being in itself, is the identity itself. Okay, so let's break that down, shall we? So, referring to my notes I put in my margins, or my little notes. I put identity is the realization of oneself as part of universal existence. Okay, so, if you look at previous videos I did about Hegel's text, Hegel has this running theme throughout all of his works about singular versus universal, right? Existence as a universal and also existence as individual singular. And there's this contradiction that goes on, but it's a dialectical contradiction, right? It's a contradiction that moves existence forward. It moves being forward. There's individuals. Existence is made up of individuals, which together make a universal existence. And it is through that interaction between individuals creating this universal, and this kind of like this back and forth universal singular that drives existence forward. Now then, part of doing that individual moving existence forward by manifesting universal being is through identification. The singular, the individual, has to self-identify, right? As Hegel is saying here. He uses the word self-identity many times. Now, let me read you this other notation I put. The self is the universal, but only as part of the universal. So, understanding the self in relation to the universal is to negate oneself as part of the universal. Okay. However, the universal cannot exist without the negation, since the self manifests the universal through its negation. So that's what I put. And so that's what I'm talking about, that contradiction. The self has to find its identity. Like, using my example, my name, Neil Trotter. Okay, I'm Neil Trotter. But Neil Trotter is not all of existence, right? Nil charter has to join with the universal existence, with other beings and other existence as part of this whole existence. And in that way, there's this like self-negation that happens. Like, okay, I'm putting myself behind the universal existence to push that forward. Like, I gotta find how I integrate or operate within this universal existence, right? And in that way, I'm disregarding part of myself, right, to push to interact with this universal existence. But it's kind of more complicated than that. We're going to discuss more about the disregarding and dismissing of the self as not really truly a dismissing and a disregarding. Right. Rather, it's a manifesting and it's an actualization. Okay, so we'll continue. But let me read you some more notes I put. Therefore, identity is the contradiction of the self and universal existence. Okay? So that's what I was just saying. Identity is understanding one's ecological relation with existence. Okay? So existence is an ecology, right? It's individuals interacting with each other and with the relationship that is built with those interactions that creates this universal being, this universal existence. That's when you look at the world and you see like the world as a whole or the universe as a whole. It's what it really is relationships between individuals or singularities or singular beings. So we begin on that foundation, but I will continue reading. Okay, now I'm on if we're using that same pagination system, it's 11.262. All right, and I'm going to start here. Internally, therefore, identity is absolute non-identity. Okay, but it is also the determination of identity over against non-identity. Right. So, like I was saying, you're disregarding, but you're actually not disregarding. It's interesting, but I'll continue. For as immanent reflection, it posits itself as its own non-being. It is the whole, but as reflection, it posits itself as its own moment. I'm actually looking at the other page here. As the positedness from which it is turning back into itself. Thus, identity is such only as a moment of itself, as determination of simple self-equality over against absolute difference. Self-equality over against absolute difference. Right. So that's identity is that, right? Which we don't think of identity as. So self-equality, equating your individual self with all of existence, which is what? Acknowledging the ecology of existence, understanding like, oh, I'm just a part of this overall universal existence. I'm a part of that, right? So I'm equal to that, right? But it's a self, right? So you are acknowledging the self. So it's a self-equality, as opposed to absolute difference, as opposed to saying like, well, I'm an individual. I'm different from all of reality. I'm different, that's what makes me an individual. We kind of have that notion of individuality today, which Hegel would argue is that's an incorrect understanding of individualism or individuality. But let me skip down to, so the number is 11.263. See, let me just remind you. There. Right there, if you have an edition of Hegel and they use that universal pagination system. Yeah. So we're there. Truth is complete only in the unity of identity and difference, and consequently that it only consists in this unity. Okay, I skipped down a few lines. The moment one insists that identity is absolutely separate from difference, and in this separation takes it to be something essential, valid, true, then what transpires from these two contradictory claims is only the failure to reconcile these two thoughts. That identity is as abstract identity, essential, but that as such it is equally incomplete. What is lacking is the awareness of the negative movement as which, in these claims, identity itself is displayed. Identity is identity essentially as separation from difference, or in the separation from difference. Then, right there we have the expressed truth about it, namely that identity consists in being separation as such, or in being essentially in the separation, that is, it is nothing for itself. Okay? So that's the first realization, which is what we're talking about. When you figure out your identity, you realize, the Hegel is saying like, okay, ultimately to really be involved in like the truth of being, like this absolute truth, right? You have to realize that your identity doesn't exist for itself. It exists for everything else. It exists universally, right? All identities are not existing for themselves. Like if they are, then something's wrong, right? That's what he's saying. It's not a separation when you say like I identify as this, which is I'm different, I'm separate. That true identification is not that. Right. So I put in my notes, identity is the actualization of the ecological nature of existence. Okay, so now I'm going to move to 11.266. And we're going to continue on this line of thought, this theme. Difference in itself is the difference that refers itself to itself. Thus, it is the negativity of itself, the difference not from another, but of itself from itself. It is not itself, but its other. What is different from difference, however, is identity. Difference is, therefore, itself and identity. Okay? The two together constitute difference. Difference is the whole and its moment. All right, so I put in my notes here. One's identity is not self. Rather, it is one's relation with whole existence. Okay, so that's important to understand. When I identify as something, for example, I call myself the black ponderer. So I say that I'm black. Right, I know some people are bothered by that, but let's roll with that example. I'm black man, black American, right? But that is not like myself. That's not myself. That's my identity. What I'm saying when I say black ponder is what I'm saying is I'm acknowledging my relation with existence as a whole. That's part of my relation with all of existence, because as I said in many videos in the past, my black identity influences how I interact with society at large, or basically existence, and that's independent of the self, like what I do. Right? Existence has its thing that it's going to be like, okay, the society has its rules and its like biases and its preconceived notions, and you are this, and therefore we're going to treat you as such. But that's not actually the self, the blackness. It's the identity. So this is important to understand, right? Because this is where people kind of get confused and get angry and irritated and like start like yelling at each other when we talk about identity politics. Right? But they're kind of missing the point of what really is identity politics. When we talk about identity politics, we're talking about the relation between the self and the environment, the existence, the circumstances of the world around oneself. Okay, so let me continue my notation. Our relation with existence is not us. It is different from self. Yet, that difference, that identity, defines existence. Okay? Existence is our relationship between our self and it. Right? That's what existence is. It's the relationship between the individual and the universal. Is that dialectical contradiction. Right? This is what Hegel's saying. Now, let me continue with some Hegel quotes. Difference is the whole and its own moment, just as identity equally is its whole and its moment. This is to be regarded as the essential nature of reflection and as the determined primordial origin of all activity and self-movement. So what's being said there? I refer to my notes. The reflection of ourself off of existence is how reality originates. Right, so that is the manifesting of reality, is this relationship with oneself and all of existence, right? Is that ecological interaction. That is what existence is. Now, let me continue. Listen to this. I mean, look at this. This is important. I'm just going to skip down a few paragraphs. And at this section, I got to speak to the microphone. This section is called diversity. Isn't that interesting? It's called diversity. Right. It's funny how people get upset when you're talking about when you start bringing up okay, we need to talk about inclusivity, diversity, social issues, and they get mad. Identity politics, people get mad about that kind of stuff. Hegel talks about these things. Identity, diversity, inclusivity, the individual with the universal. He's talking about this kind of stuff. I'll continue. Identity internally breaks apart into diversity because as absolute difference in itself, it posits itself as a negative of itself, and these, its two moments, itself and the negative of itself, are reflections into themselves, are identical with themselves, or precisely because it itself immediately sublates its negating and is in its determination reflected into itself. So, he's talking about reflecting itself with itself. He's just talking about the interaction between the individual and the universal, and that kind of dialectical interaction. It's within the universal you see the individual, and with the individual you see the universal. So this individuality, this self-identity, is defining what universal being is, like the society or the world at large, and vice versa. Using the black ponder as an example, society defines blackness, and then I take that definition, I identify as such because of how the universal is interacting with me. Now I take on that identity and I influence that identity and I use it to interact in ways with the universal, right? And so now I define the universal within that interaction that was created by the universal. Well, my identity is interacting with the society that identifies as society, which the society then takes and defines me through its interaction that it imposes on me. So it's like this dialectical thing. The different subsists as diverse, indifferent to any other, because it is identical with itself, because identity constitutes its base and element, or the diverse remains what it is even in its opposite identity. Diversity constitutes the otherness as such of reflection. The other of existence has immediate being, where negativity resides for its foundation. But in reflection, it is self-identity, the reflected immediacy that constitutes the subsistence of the negative and its indifference. I'm just going to keep reading here, but we'll provide some supplementary notes to help us think this through. But let me keep reading. The moments of difference are identity and difference itself. These moments are diverse when reflected into themselves, referring themselves to themselves. Thus, in the determination of identity, they are only self-referring. That's exactly what I was talking about with my example that I just stated. Identity is not referred to difference, nor is difference referred to identity. Hence, inasmuch as each of these moments is referred only to itself, the two are not determined with respect to each other. Now, because in this way, the two are not differentiated within the difference, the difference is external to them. Okay, that's key. The difference is external to them. The diverse moments therefore conduct themselves with respect to each other, not as identity and difference, but only as moments different in general, indifferent to each other and to their determinateness. Okay, let's break that down. Let me refer to you some of my notes that I wrote here in the margins. Because the self is not whole existence, but whole existence manifests via its relation with all selves. Okay, so the self, the individual, me, let's use me as an example. I'm not whole of existence, right? But I manifest. I'm part of the manifestation of whole existence. Like of all what's happening, I as an individual create that entire being, the universe. And it's not just me, it's all individuals, right? And whether that be human beings, other animals, other even inorganic materials that you can constitute as individual, singular interactions, right? They create universal being too. That's what we're talking about. Individually, we're not whole existence, but collectively we are. So the difference between all cells relating results in existence manifesting as radical diversity. So that's what Hegel is saying. Like all of these individuals who are all different, right? All these different interactions are creating this universal existence, which is another contradiction, right? Because there's all these different entities, right? Me, you, everybody watching, all the human beings, which are radically different people, and not what about all the animals, like all the plants that are around us and all the molecules that I'm breathing, all of this stuff, all the stuff that goes on in outer space even, right? With all those individual interactions, all that diversity is creating this universal whole, which when looked at universally lacks any diversity whatsoever. Right? But when you look at it individually, you see lots of diversity. So the diversity is necessary to create the whole. And let me read you some more notes. The relationship between existence and self is external to self, but not existence. Therefore, existence depends on identity, but the self does not depend on existence, since the self is the identifier. So that's important, right? So identity is needed. Identity politics is needed, is what I'm saying. Because individuals self-identifying creates or manifests whole existence, right? That's the power of identity, of identifying. It's not that we individuals depend on our identification. It's just that whole existence does, right? But the thing is, whole existence is part of how individuals manifest, right? Because it's this dialectic. So in a way, we kind of do depend on identity, but we don't. It's a contradiction, right? Which Hegel's all about that. But I mention that because I want to stress people's misinterpretation of identity and what it means to identify, particularly in this world where that kind of talking, I identify as this, I identify as that, and lots of people dismiss it as wokeness or whatever. But that's what we need, right, to move forward and manifest being, progress being forward, progress our existence forward. That's why it's important. And it's not like the individuals that are doing that, they're not just helping themselves, they're helping all of us when they do that. That's what Hegel is talking about here, right? So I'll continue. This is difference. When the self is not allowed to self-identify, the manifestation of existence is hindered, right? I just wrote that. That's what I said. Now, you might say well, how does that work? Or where are you getting that at? Well, we're going to read some more quotes, and I'm going to try and convince you this is what Hegel's talking about. Okay, so let's talk more about the role of identity in dialectical reality. We're talking about this dialectic, this contradiction, this going back and forth, opposing of essences and things to push being reality forward. That's in Hegel's mind, like his idea is like, okay, that's just how existence creates and moves forward and progresses. It's through a constant going back and forth between opposing forces or opposing ideas or concepts. And so the contradiction of the individual and the universal creates progression. It doesn't cancel each other out. So that's the thing with the contradiction. Contradiction in Hegelian terms is this progressing. It's not like the classical or like the superficial definition of contradiction, like what you see in the dictionary, right? Is this canceling out, like, okay, this contradicts this, and therefore there's this negation that happens, and so both objects go away, right? There's this canceling, but that's not in Hegel's philosophy. Contradiction doesn't cancel things; it actually moves things forward. It's a way that existence progresses and develops and further manifests and creates. So I'm going to read you this quote here. It is 11.276, in case you're still reading along. And he uses this example. Like it's kind of like this math example, or like listen to this. We're going to use this math example, and I'm going to like bring it home or like kind of tie it together. So Hegel writes, according to the first sense, positive y and negative y equals 0. Plus 1 minus 1 equals 0. 1 minus what equals 0. Positive to negative number equals 0. They cancel each other out. That's what he's saying. Okay. Or he uses like negative 8 plus 3. The positive 3 are negatives in the 8. So he's talking about the classical, or the like kind of the more superficial definition of contradiction. The opposites cancel themselves in combination. And then he uses further examples. A 1 hour march is made to the east, and an equal march back to the west undoes it. So many are the debts pending that many less assets are available. So many are the assets available that many debts are absolved. The 1 hour march to the east is not in itself a positive march, nor is the march to the west a negative march. The directions are rather indifferent to this determinateness of opposition. Okay, so Hegel, he's going to bring up the difference when he's talking about contradiction. So he says only a third standpoint external to both makes a positive of the one and a negative of the other. Okay, a third external standpoint. Right. So what's this? So also debts are not a negative in and for themselves, but are such only with reference to the one in debt. For the creditor, they are a positive asset. They are a sum of money or anything else of a given value, which in accordance with standpoints external to it is either debt or asset. Okay, so what we're talking about contradiction is dependent on the perspective, the standpoint. Okay, this is where when we're talking about negation, the negating happens based off the perspective. Right. This is important. Let me read you my notes. This is the external relation between the self and existence, the identity, which is also the difference. It is the external interactions, i.e. the social economics, that develops the identity, not the self. Okay? And when we talk about the given value, when he was talking about debts and assets, the giver is the relation, the social conditions. Okay, when we talk about the value, when they say about like money, cash. What is cash? Cash is like a construct. It doesn't really exist. It just exists in our minds, right? And it's a way that we function to give value. But when I pull out $1, it's just a piece of paper. It only means something because it's this like agreed upon interaction with everybody, right? And this is what Hegel's talking about. You look at most anything. So like the social constructs are what creates like the simplified version of negation or canceling out. What is debt really? Right? And debt is like an owing of something to somebody else, but that's like a subjective idea, right? Like, oh, you owe me this because of, you owe me $15, but I can, somebody could say like, oh, you don't owe me anything. I gave you, $2,000 and you don't owe me a damn thing. I just gave you $2,000. It's fine. And then there's no more debt. It's all like, but then somebody else would be like, no, you still owe me $2,000 and you owe me more because I did this, and this for you. It's all perspective, right? So that's important to understand. Even with the number system, right? That's all perspective too, because while there's a whole debate about whether math is created or discovered, right? But we find mathematics doesn't describe all of reality, and you can certainly create mathematics that does not describe like what's actually happening in the real world. It's all perspective. So that's important to understand, because that's why like Hegel's definition of contradiction is valid, because he's using contradiction in a way that doesn't negate or cancel. He's using it from a perspective of universality, right? He's using it from a perspective of interrelation, right? And diversity, right? So diverse perspectives, right? So when you use contradiction in that way, then there is no like canceling out. There's only like a moving forward, because Hegel's concept of contradiction can throw people off. But I think he does. That's a nice explanation there that he gives to provide some guidance with like, this is what I mean when I say contradiction. And to that end, we return back to the whole notion of like individual does not cancel universal. Like when you identify as something, you're not like necessarily canceling something out. And then also when you say like, I'm going to use my identity to interact with the world in productive ways, right? And then you could view that as like, oh, so you're giving yourself up, you're giving your individuality up for the universal, right? That's not necessarily what's happening, right? You're not canceling yourself out to do good, right? Rather, you're progressing your individuality further, right? At the same time, there is this like, you are giving yourself up, but that giving yourself up is not a canceling out, right? So let's talk about that. Okay, this is the 11.285. Hopefully I'm using this numbering page numeration system correctly. If you so choose to follow along, but this is remark number 2 in that section. Hegel says, he writes, the so-called principle of the excluded middle. Okay, here's another example. Something is either A or it's not A. There's no third. Okay, what's this all about? This principle contains, first, that everything is an opposite, determined either as positive or as negative. It is an important principle, necessary because identity passes over into diversity, and diversity into opposition. I don't know, that sounds like some wokeness to me, but I digress. But this is not the sense in which it is normally understood, for its ordinary meaning amounts rather to just this, that of all predicates, either this one here or its non-being comes to a thing. Here, the opposite of the predicate signifies a mere lack, or rather indeterminateness, and the principle is so insignificant that it is hardly worth the effort of enunciating it. Okay, so let me refer to my notes. Because certain identities cannot be determined within established social economic frameworks, they are deemed opposite, other, quote, other. And diversity is rejected as opposition. So this is what he's talking about. All right, this is what's going on. I talk about social economics because we're talking about identity politics, and we're talking about manifesting reality. And so when you live in a society where certain identities are rejected, they just disregard it, then what's going on is like, oh, they're othering it. othering these identities, which means they can't interact with the universal reality. They're universal. These identities are rejected as the universal existence, and so they're not included in the manifestation of universal existence. So the thing is, universal existence can't progress. It can't move forward. Like, existence can't like evolve or develop further, right? And this is why Hegel's so focused on diversity, because the more diversity is allowed, the more that kind of contradictory process happens, and which leads to a more and more progression with existence. And when that's hindered, when this something is either A or it's not A, that kind of like principle of excluding like other perspectives, right? That's a problem, right? That's what Hegel's talking about here. So then how is self-identification done, identifying oneself in a constructive way? Like, how is this othering overcome, right? And so let me read you 11.389. That's the part we're at, okay? Real possibility is the necessary only in itself, but as posited, it is the mutual otherness of actuality and possibility. Real necessity thus contains contingency. It is the turning back into itself from the restless being the other of each other. I like that. Being the other of each other. Of actuality and possibility, but not the turning back from itself to itself. In itself, therefore, we have here the unity of necessity and contingency. This unity is to be called absolute actuality. Let me read you my notes here. When the othering is realized through empathy as collective being, true self-actualization takes place, okay? So when the othering happens, like, oh, well, what is this identity that you've created? What is this? And then, then there's this opposition, this conflict. But then when people start to accept, like, oh, okay, I see why you're identifying as this, because you feel this way and you relate to society in this way, right? Okay, this is good. We should include you in this identity, and then you can help us all out, and then we can help you out, right? And in this way, this is when the person who identifies as the initially rejected identity, right? When the person that's othered becomes accepted through empathy, right? Then they're able to self-actualize, meaning that they now understand how they can truly relate with existence in a progressive, positive way, right? And this is how it works. This is the circle, the contradiction, the dialectical relationship that we all have with existence. So let's continue talking about that process, okay? This is 12.46. Okay, existence as a dialectic. Okay, let's talk about that. The underlying basis of the distinction between contrary and contradictory concepts, of which we are specifically detailing here, is the reflective determination of the diversity and opposition. Okay, they are viewed as two particular species, each fixed for itself and indifferent towards the other, without any thought being given to the dialectic and the inner nothingness of these differences, as if that which is contrary would not equally have to be determined as contradictory. The nature and the transition essential to the forms of reflection which they express have been considered in their proper place. In the concept, identity has developed into universality. Okay, identity has developed into universality. All right. Difference into particularity, opposition, which returns to the ground, into singularity. In these forms, those determinations of reflection are present as they are in their concept. The universal has proved itself to be not only the identical, but at the same time the diverse or contrary as against the particular and the singular, and then also to be opposed to them or contradictory. But In this opposition, it is identical with them, and it is their true ground in which they are sublated. The same applies to particularity and singularity, which are likewise the totality of the determinations of reflection. Okay? So I'll just summarize that with my notes here. Through diversity, we have universal existence, since a universality conceptually needs the opposition of diversity to manifest. In other words, complex ecology creates radical interconnectivity, which is general universality, right? And, that's what we're talking about. So we bring it back to identity politics and people identifying as various beings that may seem contradictory or opposed to established norms in society, but that contradictory is necessary for being to manifest forward, to progressively evolve and develop. Right? This is what Hegel's saying, and the more identities, the better, because we need a diverse array of identities so that the contradiction can be healthy and strong and keep moving forward. So let's talk more about how this process occurs. And this is 12.77. For inasmuch as the subject has raised itself to universality, it has become in this determination equal to the predicate, which, as the reflected universality, also contains particularity within itself. Subject and predicate are therefore identical. Okay, that is in the cupola, I looked it up, a connecting word. That's the definition of this, copula. So in the connecting word, they have come to coincide. This identity is the genus, or the nature of a thing in and for itself. Inasmuch as this identity, therefore, again divides, it is the inner nature by virtue of which a subject and a predicate are connected to each other. Okay, so my notes, the particular identifies the universal. So by the individual identifying, by doing that, the person also identifies the universal being. Like self-identifying tells society about itself, right? Example, Black Ponder. I identify as a Black American, so that identification communicates or describes what's going on in reality as a whole, if you really think about it. And let me continue with Hegel, though. This is a connection of necessity, wherein the two terms of the judgment are only unessential distinctions. That what belongs to all the singulars of a genus belongs to the genus by nature, is an immediate consequence. It expresses what we have just seen, that the subject, e.g., all humans, sheds its form determination, and the human being is what it should say instead. Okay? Yeah, so my notes. It is the diversity of all our identities which manifests universal existence. Okay? What does it mean to be a human being? Right? It is the combination of all of these identities that people are identifying as. Right? And when you take all of that into consideration, then you have a more accurate definition of human being, right? As opposed to like rejecting all these identities, then you have like not an accurate definition of what it means to be a human being. But I'm gonna continue. I skip down a few lines, still around the same section. This objective universality is posited and first posited with this determinate this as essential to it, eminent to it, second posited with it as diverse from it, a particularity for which the said universality constitutes the substantial basis. And then I skip down 3 lines. The species is a species only in so far as, on the one side, it exists in singulars, and on the other side, it possesses the genus, a higher universality. So now let us keep rolling with this idea. But now we're gonna kind of bring it back to, again, with identity politics and like the true definition of like politics, as you know, when we're talking about like the root word of politics, the PO for power, right? The flow of power in society, right? So identity as a form of power. And then so now we're talking about like struggle, resistance, conflict. This is important because we often dismiss that concept, identity politics. Oh, don't talk to me about that. That's just wokeness. That's SJW stuff. But no, it's important. So let me read you this. Okay, so we are on section 12.141. Resistance is the precise moment of the overpowering of the one object by the other, for it is the initial moment in the distribution of the communicated universal and in the positing of the self-referring negativity of the singularity to be established. Resistance is overpowered when its determinateness is not commensurate to the communicated universal which the object has accepted and which is supposed to be singularized in the latter. The object's relative lack of self-subsistence is manifested in the fact that its singularity lacks the capacity of what is communicated to it, and is therefore shattered by it, for it is unable to constitute itself as subject in this universal, cannot make the latter its predicate. Okay, so here we get to the key parts. Violence against an object is for the latter something alien, only according to the second aspect. Power becomes violence when power in objective universality is identical with the nature of the object, yet its determinateness or negativity is not the object's own immanent negative reflection, according to which the object is a singular. All right, we're gonna talk this through, but let me finish Hegel's thought here. Insofar as the negativity of the object is not reflected back into itself in the power, and the latter is not the object's own self-reference, the negativity as against the power is only abstract negativity, whose manifestation is extinction. Power as objective universality and as violence against the object is what is called fate, a concept that falls within mechanism insofar as fate is called blind. That is, its objective universality is not recognized by the subject in its own specific sphere. Okay. So, power becomes violence. I'm just reading you my notes here. This is a summary. Power becomes violence when one uses one's freedom to assert one's individuality without constructive application toward the universal. So, let me repeat that. Power becomes violence when the individual rejects the universal. When it's like, no, I want to self-identify as this, and I'm just using this for the service of me, myself. That type of rejection of the universal, like you're not using your identity to help all. Rather, you're using your identity just to help yourself or your individual identity. Right? You don't recognize the collective. You don't acknowledge the universal. Right? That's violence when you identify without that acknowledgement. But let me skip down a few lines. Okay, we're at section 12.142. Only self-consciousness has fate in a strict sense because it is free, and therefore in the singularity of its I, it is absolutely exists in and for itself and can oppose itself to its objective universality and alienate itself from it. By this separation, however, it excites against itself the mechanical relation of fate. Hence, for the latter to have violent power over it, it must have given itself some determinateness or other over against the essential universality. It must have committed a deed. Self-consciousness has thereby made itself into a particular, and this existence, like abstract universality, is at the same time the side open to the communication of its alienated essence. It is from this side that it is drawn into the process. A people without deeds is without blame. It is wrapped up in objective, ethical universality. It is dissolved into it. It is without the individuality that moves the unmoved, that gives itself a determinateness on the outside in an abstract universality, separated from the objective universality. Yet in this individuality, the subject is also divested of its essence, becomes an object, and enters into the relation of externality towards its nature, into that of mechanism. Okay, so power becomes ethical. Power is non-violent when one applies one's individuality to construct universal being. So when we identify as something, and then we use that identity to construct the universal existence, to construct reality as this universal construct, right? Manifest, I would say more manifest or create this existence as a universality. That's power as nonviolence, right? That's constructive power. So when you ignore the universal application of your identity, that's violence. That's using your power in unethical ways. But when you use your identity to help universal existence progress, that is an ethical utilization of power. That's a nonviolent way of utilizing your power because you're manifesting universal existence further. So let's focus more on the concept of like power and and violence. And oftentimes we think of violence as a way of reaching a means, an end goal, and that's how power is utilized. Like when people are violent, it's like, oh yeah, you got to be violent. That's how power is used. Like power is a tool, and the result of using the tool is violence. Okay, let me apply some more bug spray because these bugs are aggressive. Oh. See, I'm not using violence. I'm using my power to use natural insect repellent. So rather than the insects dying or like me swatting them, they just like fly away. So non-violence, right? But yeah, so how do you use power non-violently? Is there a way? Of course. And Hegel describes that here. This is section 12.177. The identity of concept and objectivity as a universal in which the opposition, the presence of the particular, is dissolved in its self-identical negativity and is equality with itself. The connection of the subjectivity of the simple concept existing for itself and of the concept's objectivity which is distinguished from it. Okay, here's some more. As this connection, the idea is the process of disrupting itself into individuality and into the latter's inorganic nature. Okay, inorganic nature, what's that? That's the spirit, the soul, right? The metaphysical, right? And then bringing this inorganic nature again under the controlling power of the subject and back to the first simple universality. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process. Because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn opposition within it. Its repose consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates that opposition and eternally overcomes it, and in it rejoins itself. Okay? So I wrote my notes here. The struggle to find one's true identity as an individual, and through that realization, also understanding the individual identity's purpose is to manifest the universal. Okay, so that's part of that struggle. What is the nonviolent utilization of power? That's being able to identify with yourself, being able to discover who you are as an individual. Like, okay, this is who I really am. right? And then once you find that, and then Hegel uses the word freedom, because you have to be free to find that. And so we live in a world where lots of people are oppressed and they're unable to discover their true selves, and so they can't be part of this process. But if you are free to discover your true self, and then you're like, okay, now that I know who I truly am, now I can apply that to make the world a better place, basically. That is power utilized constructively, because now you're being involved with being, capital B, like Hegel's concept of being. You're manifesting existence because you're using yourself, your true identity, in service of everything else. But you have to understand your individuality. So the thing is, you're not negating or canceling out your individuality. Rather, you're using that individuality. You have to use it. You can't cancel it out. You have to use it to help society grow and progress and evolve. And that's the struggle that you need power to overcome. But you can use power violently, or you can use power ethically, non-violently. Let me read you this quote. This is section 12.182. The originative judgment of life consists therefore in this, that it separates itself off as individual subject from the objective, and since it constitutes itself as a negative unity of the concept, makes the presupposition of an immediate objectivity. But that's what we were just talking about in a more complicated, convoluted way, as Hegel likes to talk in such ways. But we were just saying that so once you figure out who you are as an individual, you use that individuality to create universal existence. You help in that process, and by doing that, you do give up yourself, but you give up yourself in this manifestation. So you, in a way, conserve yourself too, right? And this is that contradiction, right? And here's more about the utilization of power for constructive means rather than violent means. Okay, so this is page numeration 12.187. Okay. This process begins with need, that is, the twofold moment of self-determination of the living being, by which the latter posits itself as negated and thereby refers itself to an other, then it to the indifferent objectivity, but in this self-loss it is equally not lost, preserves itself in it, and remains the identity of the self-equal concept. Okay, listen to this. The living being is thereby the impulse to posit as its own this world which is other than it, to posit itself as equal to it, to sublate the world and objectify itself. Its self-determination has therefore the form of object externality, and since it is at the same time self-identical, it is the absolute contradiction. And see, that's, again, Hegel saying what we've been talking about. It is like you're objectifying yourself in a subjective way. Right? You're not just throwing yourself away, like saying okay, I don't matter at all, or my individuality doesn't matter at all, and only the universal matters. You're not saying that. So you are being subjective, but you're using your subjectivity objectively, right? And that's the contradiction. But it's a contradiction that doesn't negate. It's a contradiction that progresses. Since the essential moments of its unity are each realized as a totality for itself, the concept splits into two, becoming an absolute inequality with itself, and since even in this rupture, the concept remains absolute identity. The living being is for itself the rupture, has the feeling of this contradiction, which is pain. Pain is therefore the prerogative of living natures. Since they are the concretely existing concept, they are in actuality of infinite power, so that they are in themselves the negativity of themselves. That their inner negativity exists for them. That in their otherness they preserve themselves. I refer you to my notes. The process of self-actualization along with transcendence, okay, I use that word, transcendence. Transcendence to me means you self-actualize, you found who you are as an individual, your true self, and now you're going to use that true self to help society become better. Okay, so you're transcending your subjectivity into an objective goal, right? You're not just in yourself. You're not just dwelling in yourself. You're now using yourself to help others, right? And that's kind of like a transcendence. So I use that word. So the process of self-actualization along with transcendence is one that includes suffering, as one has to go through the pain of being othered, then use that othered identity, which is self-determination, to determine reality universally. Okay? So yeah, you do have to go through that process of pain, right? Because that's just the world works like that. How you're like, okay, I gotta find my true self. Sometimes you get rejected. Sometimes people don't want to, accept your true self, or like your true self goes into conflict with other aspects of society. Like when people diss like identity politics, or they misinterpret what identity politics even means, or identity politics is redefined as this thing that is not really what it initially was, or the original concept of identity politics is lost, right? All this other type of negation of all these identities, and you have to kind of assert yourself and be like, no, I am this is who I am, and I'm going to use who I am to help, right? And that's hard. It's going to generate pain, but the pain is just a necessary consequence of the manifesting of universal reality. This is what Hegel is talking about. Yeah, so I'm not into the camp of pain is like necessary to find meaning, or like you can always find pain in struggle. That's not necessarily true. I don't believe in that. But sometimes pain is just something you have to go through. But how does that become meaningful? Because a lot of pain is just not meaningful at all. A lot of conflict is meaningless. And you see all this suffering, you're like, damn, what a tragedy. All that pain and suffering meant nothing at the end. I mean, that happens often, right? But how does struggle and pain and conflict, when is it meaningful? Okay, so let's see here. Yes, this is section 12.209. And yeah, I'll read now. Inasmuch as in a first moment synthetic cognition passes over from abstract identity to relation, or from being to reflection, it is not the absolute reflection of the concept that the latter recognizes in its subject matter. The reality that the concept gives itself is the next stage, namely the said identity in diversity. As such, an identity that equally is therefore still inner in only necessity, it is not the subjective identity existing for itself, hence not as yet the concept as such. Synthetic cognition therefore does also have for its content the determinations of the concept. The object is posited in them, but they stand only the subjective concept as a universal that in and for itself lacks determination, stands opposed to the objective world from which it derives determinate content and filling. But in the practical idea, it is as actual that it stands over against the actual, but the certainty of itself that the subject possesses in being determined in and for itself is a certainty of its actuality and of the non-actuality of the world. It is the singularity of this world and the determinateness of its singularity, not just its otherness as abstract universality, which is a nullity. Okay, so this is section 12.233. We're continuing our summarization with Hegel's quotes of what we said all along. Okay, so I'm going to read here. What the practical idea still lacks is the moment of real consciousness itself. Namely, that the moment of actuality in the concept would have attained for itself the determination of external being. This lack can also be regarded in this way, namely that the practical idea still lacks the moment of the theoretical idea. That is to say, in the latter there stands on the side of the subjective concept, the concept that is in process of being intuited in itself by the concept. Only the determination of universality, cognition only knows itself as apprehension, as the identity of the concept with itself, which for itself is indeterminate. Okay, we're saying a lot of stuff here. Let me pause and say, like, okay, when we say only knows itself as apprehension, what we mean apprehension, understanding reality as ecological, like understanding that what reality ultimately is interrelation between individual beings, right? And then that interrelation creates this universality, which is basically ecology, right? And then when we say indeterminate, we're talking about how oneself fits in the ecology is still being determined, right? So that process of it's not over yet when you when you find your true self, it's not over yet. You're still at this flux because a lot of people are like, oh, I know who I really am now. Okay, now what? Right? And a lot of people don't get to the point where it's like, oh, okay, now that I know who I really am, I can use that identity and all the pros and positives that identity has, that realization. I can use it to help manifest reality further. And that's where you get to the point where you're now becoming determined. That's self-determination, right? But before then, you're still indeterminate. So I was going to continue here. The feeling that is the objectivity determined in and for itself is for the identity a given. What truly exists is for it the actuality present there independently of any subjective positing. All right, so. And I put in my notes here, the theoretical is wrapped only in the individual, okay? Because we were talking about theory versus practical idea, theoretical idea, right? So the theoretical is only wrapped in the individual, right? Because we were talking about, okay, I know who I am. I identify as this, but that's still theoretical because it's like, okay, but how are you going to apply that realization, your identity, to the rest of the world? Because that's what the existence really is that relationship between you and the rest of the world. That's true reality, right? Anything other than that is theory. Meaning, if you have this identity, but you're not using it to interact in society in constructive ways, and this theory, right? So the practical concerns the universal. The key is utilizing both, but you can't be all practical, right? You can't just think all that matters is universal being and the individual ultimately doesn't matter. You can't think like that too, because that's just practice without theory, right? Which gives you wrong conclusions. It's kind of like short-sightedness. So you limit what universal being can be, right? You limit the potential of existence, of reality, because you're not thinking. You're also not utilizing theoretical concepts like individuality, right? Okay, so I continue with some more Hegel text here. For the practical idea, on the contrary, this actuality constantly confronting it as an insuperable restriction is in and for itself a nullity that ought to receive its true determination and intrinsic value only through the purposes of the good. It is the will, therefore, that alone stands in the way of attaining its goal, because it separates itself from cognition and because for it external actuality does not receive the form of a true existence. The idea of the good can therefore find its completion only in the idea of the true, but it makes this transition through itself. And I put in my notes here, objectification of self or others without subjective utilization is just as unproductive as exclusive subjectivity. It is just as counter to being. So when you objectify people, right, without considering their true selves, without utilizing their true identities, when you just objectify them to the service of this incomplete idea of universal existence, that's just as bad as being consumed completely with subjective ideas. When you only care about yourself, or you only care about this universal idea, and you're like, okay, I don't care what your identity is, you're this, because it serves this objective idea. But the problem with that is you're not like understanding true universality, because you're just ignoring that aspect of reality, which is not conducive to reality manifesting and progressing further, right? So more Hegel here. The good is for the subjective concept the objective. Actuality confronts it in existence as an insuperable restriction, only insofar as it still has the determination of immediate existence, not of something objective in the sense that it is being in and for itself. And okay, I think I will stop reading Hegel here for this video. And, I just want to thank you for joining me on this Hegelian journey. And, I think that we need to bring Hegel into modern times. And I think much of the Hegelian school of thought today kind of still is fixated on old school application of Hegel, and it's time for us to apply Hegel in our modern society. Right? And I think Hegel has some extremely useful applications that can be utilized in today's society. When we talk about things like identity, or specifically identity politics, or the concept of diversity and inclusivity, in a world where that's more of a thing now than it ever is, and is actually being suppressed, right? We're seeing like censorship of various identities and various perspectives and points of view, and we're seeing a dismissal or ignoring or not acknowledging certain people or peoples. And that is really hindering the manifestation of existence, if you look at it in terms of Hegelian philosophy. And so when you look at it that way, I think there's definitely some modern application that could be utilized using this Hegelian thought process. So I would encourage you to utilize Hegel in that way, because a lot of people who are into Hegel, they're more into Hegel because they just want to understand complicated concepts and they want to be able to develop the mind further and process complicated ideas, and be able to like use Hegel in like some sort of mental gymnastics way. Kind of like going to the gym and lift the weights, but you're going to the mental gym and like wrestling with these complicated ideas, and the idea is like I'm developing my mind to think about more complicated things in a more useful way. And you could definitely use Hegel in that way, but I think it's also very good to utilize some of these concepts in real world ways. Right? But comment below, and if you feel so inclined, and we could talk about that further. But I would encourage you, if you're into Hegel and you want to check out his text. The Science of Logic is a very, good text. It definitely has a lot of his key ideas in there. So, check it out. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.